Kia ora Kate, me mihi ka tika ki a koe, kai whakahaere o tēnei whare, I whakatuwhera tā tātou hui, he tēnei pō. Kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Kia ora koutou, te taho toko krau anō Ngāti Porou, I te taho toko koe anō Ngāpuhi, ko Becky tohunga. Thank you for coming out on this cold night to listen to me. I'm not sure I would have. It's pretty chilly out there, so appreciate you taking the time. But of course the art is the draw card, and just heard a little bit about some of the collection down the hall there, and it's just absolutely beautiful, so I'm really privileged to be able to respond to it. I thought, I'm not an art buff by any stretch. My husband did art history at a university and is always sort of haranguing me about how I should know more about art, but anyway, I don't. But what I thought I would do in this talk is I guess respond to some of the themes of the exhibition, and hopefully that's useful to you. So if you read the blurb, in the centre of it is this whakataukī, ka hanga whare te tangata, ka hanga tangata te whare. The people shape the whare shapes the people. And so I thought a little bit about what that means really in society, in our country, elsewhere. And I looked at the works. I particularly was interested in the mataaho work, the one made out of mink blankets. And so I thought I'd start with, it reminded me of a reading, of a chapter in a book that I edited a few years ago called Our Voices, Indigeneity in Architecture. And it's actually my sister's chapter, so it's a bit nepotistic, but she's an architect, and what she's doing here is her chapter's called My Māori Spaces, Women's Spaces, and she goes through a whole lot of spaces that have influenced her and who she is, and so on. And I just want to read one of those spaces, and it's Auntie Georgie's house, Whakapaurangi Road in Ruatoria. So if anyone's been to Ruatoria, it's a very unique place, and pretty isolated, and so on. And so we used to go there as kids, and I'll just read this. Bossy auntie who hugs you. It's not a guarded, rigid or bony hug. Her hug envelops you. She is a force so honest, painfully honest and fearless. Shoes off at the door. There's a horse that comes around now and then to their place. My cousins hop on, bareback. I'm too young or scared. Cousins home from the army pitch up military tents on the immaculate lawn. Everyone's got immaculate lawns in Ruatoria, by the way. Diving stuff everywhere, and pet cats that used to be strays. My cousins, boys only, go diving with my uncle for kai moana. They know moana intimately. We go along and play with the creatures in the rock pools and help mum and my auntie make lunch. My uncle must have built a room over part of the deck. The walls are different here, rough sawn planks, painted dark green, army style. This is where we sleep when we stay. Mattresses on the floor, made up into beds. Silky minks drape lions and tigers all over the sleeping surfaces. And if you've ever been to a marae, you will know what this kind of image is. You'll see lots of mink blankets on beds with lions and tigers. A long drop sits across the damp grass, inside the pungent smell of fresh and decomposing waste mixed with ocean mist air freshener. The smell of not polluting awa and moana. We are mostly too scared to go to it at night. Mawini, a famous Hiruharama mythical figure, part goat, part man. I hear his clip-clopping some nights, but I'm safe inside, surrounded by my sleeping whānau. So I was just, her chapter sort of goes on to talk about all of the ways in which the whare has made her. And growing up next to her, of course, all of those things are really evocative of my childhood, and the mink blanket thing, I just think is such, as soon as I saw it, I thought, oh, this really kind of evokes a sense of home, of kind of belonging, of being part of something, and so on and so on. The rest of the talk will really kind of draw on that link between the things that make us, the way the built environment shapes us, but also some of the injustices in that, who gets to choose how our spaces and places are created. So I thought I'd start with a few problems. So I think there's a really large problem of presentism, where our society, and I'm going to pick on architects, and if there's any architects in the room, I'm going to pick on architects generally, so please don't take it personally. They're easy to pick on. I think there's a real problem with presentism, and when it comes to thinking about the built environment, everything that's sort of man or woman made around us, there's so often a really strong focus on myopic solutions. So I'll just read this really quickly. This is from a paper I wrote a few years ago with my PhD supervisor at the time. To take a well-known example, traffic congestion has been tackled through increasing road capacity, which in turn has encouraged automobile dependency. This has reduced opportunities for natural exercise, which facilitated in part an increasing incidence of obesity. This has led to growing problems of public health exacerbated by increased exhaust pollution, which contributed to increased carbon emissions, which played a role in climate change, which led to flooding in some places and desertification in others, which reduced agricultural yields, which supported the increasing use of chemical fertilisers, which leaked into our water systems and created oceanic dead zones, and so on. But the point being that we so often are focusing in on one myopic solution at the impacting the kind of wider systems in which we work, and this continues to be done, right? I think the next problem is that there's a little bit of a preoccupation with the zeitgeist. So this idea that the built form, the whare, the things around us is just destiny. We're going to, we're sort of destined to come up with the kind of built form that we see around us. So this is very, very famous architect, Mies van der Rohe. I believe that architecture has little or nothing to do with personal inclinations. True architecture is always the expression of the inner structure of our time from which it springs. And yet there's two problems with the zeitgeist. Zeitgeist being, what is sort of the ideas of the day, I guess. So it can't ever be tested, right? You can't test a zeitgeist because it's a closed argument. So this is a really good book by Ian Bentley called Urban Transformations, and he gives this example. Why is Southwell Minster church and building in the UK similar in style to other religious buildings of its time and region? Because of the zeitgeist. But how do we know there's a zeitgeist? Only because Southwell Minster is similar in style to other religious buildings of its time and region, right? So we can kind of say that about anything to almost kind of negate the fact that someone's making these decisions about how the built environment is growing and changing and evolving around us. The second problem is if we just imagine buildings to be created because of a zeitgeist, it doesn't show us how to make better places that are of that place, that are of that particular whenua, and so on. So the people shape the whare, and the whare shapes the people. Next architect, Rem Koolhaas, very famous for this. He's a very famous architect, but was very clearly not interested in context. And there's a fantastic Chinese landscape architect whose name has just gone out of my head, who wrote about how big architects like Rem Koolhaas and others came into China building these amazing kind of iconic, big, huge buildings, and having lived in China for 3 years, I saw some of them. Almost on every corner there was an iconic building. And he just writes about how they're ruining the sort of Chinese landscape because they imagine that it's the zeitgeist to build these big, iconic built forms, and that they don't have to care about the context in which they work. And it's it reeks of such an arrogance that it makes me quite angry when I hear about this. The next one, you will have heard this a lot, form follows function, Louis Sullivan. Frank Lloyd Wright reckons that's been misunderstood. He talks about form and function should be one, joined in a spiritual union. So just to sort of critique this, and again thinking about this way in which the built form, how much of it is sort of almost growing of its own, or how much are we actually dictating how the built form around us is created. There, of course, is a relationship between form and function, right? You in your kitchen you have an oven, and that cooks your food. So the form of your kitchen will be such that your oven will fit in the kitchen along with the fridge and so on. But we don't often question whose function matters, and you see the problem of that when you get a diversity of ways of thinking about how we live, right? And I used to work for Housing New Zealand when it was the policy agency, and at the time there was starting to be some kind of understanding that actually Māori whānau didn't fit in 3-bedroom houses for nuclear families with 2.5 kids, and actually maybe we need to think a little bit differently about the form of the city, and not just provide 3-bedroom houses. And so Roe Hoskins and others developed the Māori Housing Design Guide, and then eventually a Pacific Housing Design Guide was developed as well. Despite that, there continues to be a lack, in my opinion, of thinking more fundamentally about the diversity of ways that people live and inhabit space in our cities. And also involving people who are not necessarily mum, dad and 2.5 kids. So understanding how those ideas of function are generated is really important, and whose interests are being served by designing the built environment to suit one pattern of uses or another. And I live in Karori, and I don't know if any of you belong to the I Love Karori Facebook page, but it's quite a riot. The topics are lost cats and cycleways, and more often than not, people are saying that the main reason for them objecting cycleways is that shops will no longer survive. And whilst I have some sympathy for that and sympathy for shops, I think we've missed a trick when we understand our streets to be neoliberal, capitalist, functional things only. It's a very bad sentence, but I hope you know what I mean. That they're only kind of carriers of people in order to buy and sell stuff. And James and I were talking about this the other day. So what are we kind of imagining that these streets should be for? Could they be something else? Could they be places to play, or could they be places to linger? And if anyone's read The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, well worth reading, even if you're not an urban designer or an architect or anything. She was a journalist that was writing in the 1960s in New York when they were trying to put in a big motorway in Greenwich in New York. And she's talking about the life of a street, the way in which the sort of incidental meeting of people, the bumping up against people on the street, is sort of seemingly inconsequential, but it's hugely useful and important for a society and community in terms of developing trust. You know, you start to see the same faces every day, you start to maybe say hello, or, you know, and so on and so on. So imagining that our cities, our built form, might be for other than neoliberal purposes, they can also do that as well, might be useful for us. Cool. Jinks argues that built form is not just functional, but also communicates meaning, reading like a language, conveying cultural, historical and social messages. And I would add here that in Te Ao Māori, the built environment is not necessarily the most important either. So I remember writing an opinion piece a few years back when the district plan was the spatial plan for Wellington was being considered, and I imagine there's probably someone in the room who I'm going to feed, but I'll keep going. The sort of historical societies of New Zealand, of Wellington, were sort of saying, no, you can't remove the Mount Vicks, the villas in Mount Vic and because this is our cultural heritage and so on. And my piece responded by saying, whose heritage do you actually care about? Because those villas, some of them are great, and I'm not suggesting we get rid of all the villas, but they also represent a certain moment in time, a certain colonial presence, and so on and so on. Where is your anger at the loss of Māori sites of significance? Where is your anger at the loss of Urupa and so on in the city? There's nothing. And so understanding that actually the built, even being able to kind of privilege the built form is a political decision in itself, when actually the papatuanuku and the whenua is probably more of significance to other groups like Māori. So this is me in my slimmer days, because I'm not going to put a photo of me in my non-slim days. You can make the choice when you're creating your own meme. Form should allow for many functions, including and especially Indigenous functions. So that would be my meme if I was creating one. And this is just to give you a sense of what I mean. So these are all the same form. You will recognise that. This is up in Whakapara Marae near Whangarei. All very similar forms, and all able to offer multiple functions. They're sleeping places, they're meeting places, they're welcoming places, and so on and so on. So I think that form function thing is an artificial, broadly speaking, connection. And we live in unjust societies, with that injustice structurally embedded in the geography, spatiality and design of our towns and cities. That is, justice or injustice takes place somewhere. So there's a geography to justice, and there's a geography to injustice. I remember reading a thesis when I worked here that a student did looking at trees, and interestingly found that lower socioeconomic communities in Wellington had less trees than higher socioeconomic communities. So these are not just zeitgeists or fait accomplis. They're political decisions that are made by someone, somehow, somewhere. And if you just look over, I'm not expecting you to read that, by the way. I'm just giving you a sense of something. So I'm just thinking about injustice and what's happened over the last week, 2 weeks. I received this Bernard Hickey thing, and if he's set out 6 things, policy decisions that have been made, I think 4 of them focus on built form, on housing in some way. I'll read the first one. Pātaka announced on Sunday the government removed 1,000 children from living in motels, but couldn't say where they'd gone, whether they'd found new homes, given the government has halved funding for new social housing and stopped kāinga order building new homes. So we're like, where do those guys go? And so on. So justice very much takes its legs in the built form in the way in which we make decisions about it. Max Rash's book, this is less built, but Again, he's got an incredible book, by the way, if anyone's interested, called Too Much Money, I think. And one of the arguments he makes in that, and he's sort of starting to make this in here, he's talking about the benefit sanctions. What he's saying in that book is that we're very focused on sanctioning beneficiaries, and yet it's the incredibly wealthy that are actually having the much bigger impact on our systems. And I think he's got a figure, I meant to write it down. I think 10% of New Zealand owns 70% of New Zealand's wealth. It's quite shocking now. The distance between rich and poor is huge, and it's growing. So, what does all this mean for the built environment? Well, currently, our built environment serves some parts of our population and disenfranchises others. And for many Māori, which is my particular area of interest, cities are symbols of loss and disconnection and pain. But, to borrow from our Aboriginal cousins, our towns and cities always was and always will be, not good English but anyway, Indigenous places. And we must acknowledge that the built environment is a political space, and I think, again, to pick on architects and environmental professions, it's not really part of that culture to acknowledge it. And that is one of the things I love about art, is that there is a lot of kind of thinking about the way in which art might provoke and get us to sort of understand the world a bit more. In the design professions, it's not part of that culture, and to be explicit about our values, why are we making these design decisions? And unfortunately that means that this allows certain things to happen for some people, and it constrains others in ways that are not that explicit in our world. And we somehow believe that the act of designing is somehow neutral and value-free, and it's clearly not, right? Which is why it's problematic when you have certain sectors of society that dominate those professions. So what do we do about this? And thinking a little bit about the title of the talk, how do we reinsert our self-determination, our mana motuhake into built form? Sorry, that's chopped off there. So I love this idea of spatial justice, that how do we move towards a society, a built environment that allows for the fair and equitable distribution in space of socially valued resources and opportunities to use them. That's the definition. So examples, equitable access to kai. People talk about kai food deserts and so on. Healthcare, employment opportunities. Just thinking about healthcare, I was doing a training thing yesterday, and I was sitting next to a woman who was a helicopter paramedic, and I was thinking, God, your life is so exciting compared to mine, but anyway, and she flies up to Gisborne and up the east coast, and I said, I'm from there, and she said, oh gosh, it's just so, I love going up there, and I said, oh yes, lovely scenery, isn't it, a bit like the weather, so on. She said, oh no, I love the scenery, but it's the people, and they're always so grateful when we fly in on our helicopter and provide them with this sort of urgent health care, but they don't know how badly off they are, how little access to health care they actually get, and they're still grateful. And it just made my heart melt, because I was just thinking, oh God, there's people in our societies that are getting crap access to these things, I won't get political, but it feels like that's worsening, right? But resources also in terms of funding or political power, how do you fairly distribute that across our communities so that it's not sitting in certain communities? I used to be head of urban development out at Hutt City Council, and I loved it because Wainuamata was as bolshy as Eastbourne. and I remember thinking, gosh, this is so cool, because people would expect that Wainui wasn't as bolshy, it's a lower socioeconomic community and so on, but they were loud, they were out there, they were constantly challenging local government to get better access to resources and so on and so on. and they were doing just as well as Eastbourne, which, high income community, and it's just such a great example of the way in which if you if you set up your processes right, I'm not saying Lower Hutt City Council's got it all together, but if you set up good processes, you can actually enable, empower communities, whatever their socioeconomic status, to be part of this decision making. And then, of course, we've got this big, hairy problem of climate change, and if you haven't been able to choose where you live, that becomes all the more important that you have access to resilience. And what I'd love to do one day is try to map some of the most unresilient areas, particularly in cities, and just see what those communities are, how resilient they might be. So there's ongoing social and cultural injustices created by our built environment and the political decisions that sit behind them. Another example is Public Works Act. I won't go on about this too much, but because I'm probably talking to people who know about this, but clearly the Public Works Act has worked over time and time again to take particularly Māori land for the public good, and it continues. I had the privilege of listening to the author Patricia Grace just a couple of years ago, because Waka Kotahi tried to take her land for Transmission Gully. And she said they lied and they did all sorts of devious things to try to take her land under the Public Works Act. And she eventually won after having to take them to court. But Māori are still being inflicted with the Public Works Act, because I think perhaps it's seen as being easier land to take because it's communally owned. It's not owned by one person. Perhaps that's it, I don't know. But it continues. I think the other issue that continues in our society is certain value sets continue to be privileged over others. And whilst this is an image of land loss for Māori, it's also an image of the wholesale overlay of another set of values, right? A set of values that says that land should be chopped up into parcels and sold to build stuff on it for money. And that wasn't a fait accompli. That was a set of values that got overlaid on our whenua. I was involved in a project in Kiribati a few years ago, and they haven't had that. And it's kind of fascinating going to a country where none of the land is individually held. It's all completely communally owned. There's some other problems, but it's all handed down, I imagine, a little bit in the way that Māori would have if we had kept going with our sort of land management system. It's not quite the right words, but you know what I mean. And then there's this sort of sense that real place happened when the colonial project arrived. And you get lots of our cities having been designed in Britain, coming here and going, oh shit, we didn't realise there was a big mountain in the way or a big hill. And there's a lovely book by Ben Schrader, The Big Smoke, and he's got this image of these men in Dunedin pickaxing this hill so that they can put their grid pattern street down. I think, gosh, why didn't you just look at what the topography was before you designed that? And this, of course, on the right is Martinborough with its very colonial Union Jack square in the middle. Town and Country Planning Act, I might just skip that. So what do we do about this? If we go back to that whakataukī, the buildings make us and we make the buildings. I'm saying it wrong, but you know what I mean. One of the things that whakataukī indicates is a sort of temporal approach, right? It's talking about time, how things happen over time. It's not a sort of static thing that happens in a particular moment of time. There's some sense of gradual approach to it all. And one of the problems with that kind of presentism approach, all of those things I've already talked about, is a lack of understanding that actually the spaces in which we live, our cities and our built and natural environments, are actually temporal things. So if you break them up, which is useful because it's quite hard to think of a whole city all at once, into bits, you will find that different things change at different rates of time. So what I mean by that is the environmental infrastructure, i.e. our whenua, the soil, the water, the so on and so on, that is fundamental to us surviving, and it shouldn't really change ever. Well, it does change a little bit, but in its sort of fundamental form it doesn't change, ideally. We have forced it to change in some circumstances. If you think about the public space or movement network, those things last for thousands of years. If you look at, Rome and Europe and, sort of Oxford in the UK, those street systems or the public space systems have been like that for thousands of years, because once you put those bits down in our system, it's very hard to change them, because all the bits of land in between all those streets and get owned by individual people and Thank you. Then you've got the urban block, and then you've got plots, and then you've got buildings, and buildings in New Zealand have I think a 50-year, at least on paper, they're supposed to last 50 years. You'd hope they'd last longer, but it's actually not that long if you think about the wider system. And then the details, which is often the thing we focus a lot on, the street furniture, the paving, they're pretty quick, right? 10 years, So thinking about our system as a temporal system, as something where some things matter, some parts of the system matter more than others, i.e. the environment matters more than the built stuff, and the details, is really, I think, a fundamental shift that we have to make as a society. I'm just wondering if I've got enough time, but I will talk a little bit about the importance of old knowledge. So old knowledge is interesting because it's iterative. It changes and it builds and it grows over time like this, and so it's got time to be tested and refined and tested and refined and tested and refined. So it's pretty robust knowledge, stuff that has come from old is pretty robust. But there's today a very binary understanding of what old knowledge is. So people kind of think that looking backwards is like nostalgic and so on, whereas sort of modernity is kind of exciting and fresh, and we see this a little bit with AI, right? You can get information just like that, and I've just started to explore AI, and it's kind of slightly alarming the way in which you can get this information really, really quickly, and you sort of wonder how it's going to blow up on us one day. So modern knowledge happens really quickly. So it doesn't have time to iterate and be refined and tested and I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying we shouldn't chuck out the old stuff, because that's really critical as well. The problem is, if I'm thinking about my own setting, and Māori, in our Aotearoa built environment, one of the problems is, of course, colonisation, which has sort of severed the knowledge the spiral that we draw on. So many of us are left without a huge amount of deep and sustained mātauranga Māori. And I've done a few talks with other designers and things downtown, or in response to the district plan. And people will say, we need to go overseas, we need to go to Europe to find the examples, the exemplars for our cities, because Barcelona is better, or Amsterdam is better, or whatever it is. And I think, yes, I've been to those cities and they're beautiful, but they're Barcelona cities. What is it that might fundamentally be a Aotearoa city? And have we really invested in the right kind of knowledges to understand that? Instead, we sort of, our quick thing is to sort of go overseas and bring the exemplar here. So I just don't think we've invested enough in cultivating our knowledge is in this place. But there has been a response by the design sector, right? Like there's this, I'm calling it the sexy brown, where there's been quite a sort of proliferation of kind of Māori patterning and symbolism, beautiful, beautiful stuff. Like I'm not putting it down, lovely, beautiful. But what is problematic, and this is probably one of the most beautiful ones done by an artist, Lonnie Hutchinson, is it? But that wraps a justice precinct in which Māori are far more likely than others to be represented. And so I think we sort of got a bit of a mismatch going on where we're kind of creating this built form and we're going, yes, it has to have an Aotearoa-ness, so we'll put some beautiful, like I've seen this a few times, it's absolutely beautiful. But it's wrapping this justice precinct, which is full of inequities. There was a report out this morning talking about how the police are 11 times more likely to prosecute Māori for the same crimes as non-Māori, and it's just like, how do we not make these connections? So how do we build on this and create more just cities? I'm going to fly through this because I can see my time's nearly up. We need to invest in that knowledge cultivation. What does it mean? What does a Māori street look like? And this is some answers I got with a project talking with Ngāti Toa Rangatai. Daylighting our streams. This is our heritage. Many of you will know that under Wellington there's all these streams that are all kind of buried in culverts. We need to be using our own markers, our own identity markers. Anyone's read urban design literature, I'm sure you all have. Kevin Lynch talks a lot about these sort of 4 bits to a city landmarks, and the very common one, if you've ever been to Europe, is sort of being able to walk down a street and being able to see, your vista as this beautiful church at the end of the street. And we've sort of copied that, church steeples, clock towers, but we've got our own DNA, we've got our maunga. And one of the other interesting stories I had was I studied in the UK, and one of my supervisors was actually invited by Kāinga Order, then Housing New Zealand, to come and judge an urban design competition that they were running in New Zealand. And he flew into Auckland and he did his thing and came back, and he said to me, gosh, I flew into Auckland and you've just got this amazingly unique landscape, you've got all these volcanoes around the place. But you don't do anything with them. You don't make anything of them. They don't, they're not that significant in terms of the way the city is designed. You don't orientate the streets towards them, And I sort of thought, oh yeah, that's true. I mean, in the last 10 or so years, that has changed. There's now a maunga authority that looks after the maunga. But we've missed a trick, really, because you can't reorientate streets now. And we haven't celebrated what is ours. We've got the same thing here with Tangi Te Kio, I think it's called, Mount Vic. I can't remember the Māori word, sorry. But, we could have done more. This is Kaikohe. Has anyone been to Kaikohe lately? The streets are lined with te reo Māori. This is symbolising what's important in that place. And this is a fabulous group called ARCO, led by Māori women architects who work with rangatahi up there, and this was one of their projects where they put te reo Māori all over the street. Identifying, celebrating historical places. We've done a bit of this now. This is good to see. This changing, the rectifying of names is recently Petone, Te Pito, Te One, is looking to see a place name. But I worked for Hutsy Council not that long ago, 2 years ago or something, and we did a little project with a design team making these huge banners outside the library in Petone, Moira and Nainai. So Nainai is supposed to be Te Ngaingai, Moira is supposed to be Moi Te Rā, and Petone is supposed to be Te Pito Te One. And we got told off because they said, oh, we don't have a Māori language strategy. And I was like, But you wouldn't tell us off if you spelt English wrong and we were correcting that. So that, it's still taking its time to kind of weed its way through. We need to create levelers, places where you don't have to have money to go and have fun. Manaaki for people, welcoming, these places that are trying to discourage homeless people from, there's multiple things that are going on there. But, and we need to move beyond the iconic and sexy to being mundane about what it is to be Māori in our built environment, and that just being part of our everyday kind of symbolism and reading of our built environment. I think that's it. Kia ora.